Before we can understand what the brain does in those 7 minutes, we need to understand what the brain actually is. Most people have a rough picture. Gray matter, neurons, electrical signals. But the reality is far stranger and more beautiful than that rough sketch suggests. Your brain contains approximately 86 billion neurons. Let that number sit for a moment. 86 billion. If you counted 1 neuron per second, without sleeping, without stopping, it would take you over 2,700 years to finish counting. Each of those neurons is connected to somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 other neurons through structures called synapses, which means the total number of connections in your brain, the total number of pathways along which information can travel, is somewhere in the range of 100 trillion.100 trillion connections. In a space the size of your 2 fists pressed together, this is the most complex structure we have ever discovered in the known universe. Not just on Earth. In the known universe, and it runs on almost nothing. Your brain consumes roughly 20 watts of power. A dim light bulb. The most sophisticated information processing system in the cosmos, running on the equivalent of a nightlight. Now here's what's crucial to understand. That power comes from one source. Blood. Specifically the oxygen and glucose that blood carries to every corner of your brain, every second of your life. Your neurons are extraordinarily hungry. They need a continuous, unbroken supply of nutrients to maintain their electrical charge, to stay what neuroscientists call polarized. This polarization is everything. It is the tension that makes thought possible. Neurons maintain a negative charge inside their membranes by constantly pumping sodium ions out and potassium ions in, like tiny molecular engines running without pause. The moment blood stops flowing, the moment oxygen stops arriving, those engines begin to fail, and that is where our story begins. Let's slow time down. The heart stops, or the blood vessels fail, or something catastrophic happens, a massive stroke, a trauma, a sudden cardiac arrest. The exact cause doesn't matter for what we're about to explore. What matters is that the supply of blood to the brain has been cut, Zell to 10 seconds. In the first 10 seconds after circulation stops, the brain uses up the last of the oxygen that was already dissolved in its tissue. This is oxygen that was already there, already in the cells, already being used. It runs out almost immediately. As it does, neurons begin to lose their charge. They can no longer maintain that careful balance of ions. The electrical silence of unconsciousness sets in. In clinical terms, this is when a person loses consciousness. Within 10 to 20 seconds of cardiac arrest, the brain's organized electrical activity, the kind we can measure on an EEG, essentially flatlines. This is the point at which, for most of human history, we would have said, this person is dead. The brain has gone dark, but it hasn't. What happens next is what changes everything. In 2013, a team of researchers at the University of Michigan, led by Dr. Jimo Borjigin, were studying what happens to the brains of rats immediately after cardiac arrest. They had implanted electrodes in the rats' brains. They had precise measurements of what was happening electrically, moment by moment, and what they found when the rats' hearts were stopped, what they recorded in those first seconds after death, stopped them cold. There was a surge. In the 30 seconds following cardiac arrest, the rats' brains didn't go quiet. They went wild. High-frequency electrical oscillations, gamma waves, spiked to levels higher than anything recorded during normal waking consciousness. The brain wasn't dying quietly. It was firing in a frenzy. These gamma waves are significant. In neuroscience, gamma oscillations, roughly 25 to 100 Hz, are associated with the highest cognitive functions. Consciousness, perception, the binding together of information from different parts of the brain into a single, coherent experience. The binding problem, how your brain takes all those separate streams of sensory data and combines them into one unified moment of experience, is thought to involve gamma oscillations. And at the moment of death, gamma oscillations surged. Then, in 2023, a follow-up study was published. This time with humans, a team at the University of Michigan, working with data from patients who had died in the ICU after cardiac arrest, identified 4 individuals whose EEG recordings were being taken at the moment of death. What they found mirrored the rat studies precisely. In 2 of the 4 patients, there was a dramatic surge in gamma activity immediately following cardiac arrest, Akfindi in the temporo-parieto-occipital junction, a region of the brain known to be involved in conscious experience, in the sense of self, in the integration of reality, spiked dramatically at the moment of death. The researchers were careful. They did not claim this proved anything about near-death experiences. They noted the limitations. 4 patients. Unknown relationship between electrical activity and subjective experience. But the implication hung in the air, undeniable. The brain doesn't go dark at death, it blazes. Now here's where it gets truly fascinating. Because the question is not just what is happening, but why. Why would a dying brain surge with electrical activity? What is the mechanism? The answer has to do with something called ionic imbalance. And it is one of the most dramatic events in all of biology. Remember those molecular pumps we talked about? The ones that keep neurons polarized by moving sodium and potassium ions across membranes? When oxygen stops arriving, those pumps stop working. And when they stop working, ions flood across the membrane in both directions. Sodium rushing in, potassium rushing out, trying to reach equilibrium. This flooding of ions is called depolarization. When a neuron depolarizes, it fires. It sends a signal. And when all of the neurons in a region depolarize at the same time, which is what happens when the energy supply is cut, you get a wave of firing, a cascade. Neuroscientists call this spreading cortical depression, or, in its most intense form, a hypoxic spreading depolarization. It moves across the brain like a wave of neurons firing, depolarizing, going silent. Then another wave. The brain, in essence, is burning through its last reserves of electrochemical energy, in one final massive uncontrolled discharge. This is the surge. Now, and this is the part that is genuinely extraordinary, what does that surge feel like, if it feels like anything at all? We don't know. We cannot know with certainty. But we have clues. And those clues come from the people who have come back. Near-death experiences have been reported across every culture in recorded history. The ancient Egyptians described them. Plato recorded one in the Republic. A soldier named who died on the battlefield, returned 10 days later, and described what he had seen. Medieval texts are full of them. And today, in hospitals around the world, patients who are resuscitated after cardiac arrest frequently report them. The statistics are significant. Studies suggest that between 10 and 20% of cardiac arrest survivors report some form of near-death experience. That's not a fringe phenomenon. That's millions of people. And what do they report? There is a remarkable consistency across cultures, across centuries, across languages, a sense of leaving the body. Looking down from above, moving through darkness, often described as a tunnel, an overwhelming sensation of light, warm, total, encompassing, a feeling of profound peace, more complete than anything experienced in life, encounters with deceased relatives or with beings of light, a life review, rapid, panoramic, emotionally vivid, in which the person experiences the key moments of their life, sometimes from other people's perspectives. And then a boundary, a point of no return, and the pullback. The skeptical interpretation of near-death experiences is straightforward. These are hallucinations produced by a brain under extreme stress. The tunnel is the visual cortex losing its blood supply from the periphery inward. The life review is memories being triggered by random neural firing. The sense of peace is endorphins or ketamine-like compounds being released. And these explanations are plausible. They might be correct. But the gamma surge data complicates them. Because if the brain is producing a surge of integrated, coherent, high-frequency activity at the moment of cardiac arrest, activity associated with the highest forms of consciousness, then the experience being produced might not be random noise. It might be something structured. Something generated by a brain performing one last act of extraordinary, organized processing. The life review, in particular, is interesting in this context. Of all the features of near-death experiences, the life review is perhaps the most scientifically intriguing. People don't describe it as remembering. They describe it as reliving, fully, sensorially, emotionally. Not a list of events, but an immersive re-experience of them, simultaneously, or in rapid sequence, depending on the account. A woman who nearly drowned described seeing her entire life, from birth to that moment in what felt like seconds, but with every detail intact. A man who survived a fall from a building described not just seeing his memories, but experiencing them from other people's perspectives, understanding, for the first time, how his actions had felt to others. This is not how normal memory works. Normal recall is fragmentary, reconstructive, prone to error. The life review as described sounds like something else, like a sudden, massive access to stored information that is normally inaccessible. Is there a neural basis for this? Possibly. The hippocampus, the brain's primary memory consolidation structure, is one of the most sensitive regions to oxygen deprivation. As oxygen drops, the hippocampus begins a cascade of activity. Glutamate, the brain's primary excitatory neurotransmitter, floods hippocampal synapses. This glutamate flood is normally destructive. It's part of what causes the brain damage that results from prolonged cardiac arrest. But in the seconds before that damage sets in the very first moments of the cascade, it may trigger an extraordinary retrieval event. Memories encoded across years, stored in distributed networks throughout the cortex, may be activated simultaneously or in rapid sequence. The brain in its final moments may be reading itself out, not randomly, not as mere noise, but in a structured, organized way, driven by the same systems that made those memories meaningful in the first place. Think about what that means. Your brain has been recording your life. Every significant moment, encoded in the strength of synaptic connections. Every face you loved, every fear you held, every moment of beauty or shame or joy, all of it written in molecular form, in the architecture of your neurons, and in the last minutes, that archive may be opening all at once. Now let's return to that number. 7 minutes. Where does it come from? The 7-minute window has become something of a cultural shorthand for the duration of brain activity after death, and it comes from clinical experience, from the understanding that the brain, under normal conditions, can survive without oxygen for roughly 4 to 6 minutes before irreversible damage begins, and that some residual activity may persist for several minutes beyond that. But the precise timeline is more complex than any single number suggests. Different regions of the brain die at different rates. The cerebral cortex, the wrinkled outer layer responsible for thought, perception, and consciousness, is the most vulnerable to oxygen deprivation. It begins to suffer irreversible damage within 4 to 6 minutes of oxygen loss. The brainstem, the ancient deep structure responsible for basic life functions like breathing and heart rate, is more resilient. It can sometimes survive longer. The cerebellum, which coordinates movement, lies somewhere in between. And within the cortex itself, different regions have different sensitivities. The hippocampus, that vital memory structure, is among the most vulnerable. The visual cortex is slightly more resilient. So death, from the brain's perspective, is not a single moment but a sequence of regional shutdowns, each happening at its own pace, each with its own character. What the 7-minute idea captures is something real. There is a window, after the heart stops, during which the brain is still doing something, still processing, still, in some sense, experiencing. The precise duration depends on individual physiology, body temperature, whether CPR was initiated, and dozens of other factors. But the core fact stands. The brain outlasts the body not by days, not by hours, but by minutes, and those minutes may be the most intense of a human life. Here is where we have to step carefully, because we are moving into territory where science and philosophy become impossible to separate. What is consciousness? This is the hard problem, the question that has resisted every attempt at resolution. We understand, broadly, how neurons fire. We understand how information is processed, how attention works, how memory is stored, but we do not understand why any of that feels like anything. Why there is something it is like to be you, reading these words right now. The philosophers call this qualia, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the specific, irreducible quality of subjective experience. No matter how completely we describe the neural mechanisms of seeing red, the wavelengths, the receptor activations, the visual cortex processing, we have not explained why it looks red, why there is an experience happening at all. This problem is not solved. It may not be solvable by science as we currently practice it, but it bears directly on what happens in the 7 minutes after death. Because what we are really asking, when we ask what happens to the brain is there still an experience? Is there still something it is like to be this person? And the answer from the neuroscience is, we genuinely don't know. What we know is that there is still electrical activity, still organized, coherent activity, still in measurable terms, the kind of activity that we associate with consciousness when it occurs in living people, whether that activity is accompanied by subjective experience. Whether the lights are still on, in the deepest sense, is beyond our current ability to measure. But consider this: every tool we have for detecting consciousness from the outside, e.g. fMRI, PET scans, detects it by detecting brain activity. If we see the right kind of activity, we infer consciousness. If we see a gamma surge in the regions associated with conscious processing, we note it as consistent with conscious experience, and we see that surge. At death, there is a paradox at the heart of all this, and it's worth sitting with it. The dying brain, in its final minutes, may produce the most intense experience of a lifetime, and it produces this intensity precisely because it is dying. The death of the molecular pumps releases the ionic surge. The ionic surge drives the gamma waves. The gamma waves may drive a final, condensed, overwhelming experience of existence. The brain, in other words, burns brightest at the moment of extinction. This is not unlike what happens to a star. When a massive star exhausts its fuel, when the nuclear fusion that has powered it for millions of years finally runs out, it doesn't simply go dark, it collapses. And in that collapse, it briefly becomes something extraordinary, a supernova, a burst of energy more powerful than anything the star produced in its entire life, brighter than the galaxy that contains it, and then dark. The analogy is imperfect. Analogies always are. But there is something structurally similar happening in the dying brain, a system that has sustained itself carefully for decades, burning steadily, suddenly releasing everything in a final, uncontrolled burst. Is that burst meaningful? Does it constitute an experience? Is there a self, in those moments, to whom anything is happening? These are not questions science can currently answer with certainty. But they are questions that change everything about how we understand the relationship between brain and mind, between the physical substrate and whatever we mean when we say I. There is another class of evidence that we haven't fully examined yet: the detailed accounts of people who were resuscitated after prolonged cardiac arrest, and who describe experiences during the period when, by all clinical measures, their brains should have been producing nothing. The most famous study of near-death experiences is the AWARE study, Awareness During Resuscitation, conducted by Dr. Sam Parnia at Southampton University in England, and later continued at New York University. Parnia and his team placed images on shelves near the ceiling in cardiac resuscitation rooms, images that could only be seen from above, not from the patient's position on the bed. The idea was simple. If someone reported floating above their body during resuscitation, and could accurately describe the ceiling-level images, that would be remarkable evidence. The results were inconclusive. One patient reported an out-of-body experience and described events during his resuscitation with accuracy, but was not in a room where the images were placed. But Parnia's more recent work has produced something equally striking. In 2023, he published a study of over 500 cardiac arrest patients. What he found was that a significant proportion, around 40%, recalled some form of awareness during the resuscitation period. And importantly, the EEG recordings of some patients showed surges of brain activity, including gamma activity, during periods of otherwise flat brain function. The question Parnia is now pursuing is whether these are genuine experiences, real, conscious events, happening in a brain that science would classify as non-functional. And the preliminary answer is, possibly yes. This is not mysticism. This is not a religious claim. This is empirical science carefully conducted, arriving at results that our current models cannot fully explain. Let's go deeper into the biology. Because beyond the electrical surge, there is a chemical story happening simultaneously. And it may be the most mind-altering chemistry your body will ever produce. At the moment of death, several things happen in the brain's chemical environment. Endorphins, the brain's own opioid compounds, are released in significant quantities. These are the same molecules that produce the runner's high, that dull pain in moments of trauma, that generate feelings of euphoria and peace. Their release in the dying brain may account for the profound sense of peace and painlessness that near-death survivors almost universally report. Serotonin levels spike. Serotonin, broadly associated with well-being and mood, floods the synaptic cleft as neurons depolarize. The result, if there is a subjective experience accompanying this, would be a sense of profound rightness, of everything being okay. And then there is DMT, dimethyltryptamine, a compound that occurs naturally in the human body, produced among other places, in the pineal gland and in lung tissue. DMT is also the active compound in ayahuasca, the psychedelic brew used by Amazonian shamans for millennia. When administered externally, DMT produces experiences that are, by any measure, extraordinary. Encounters with entities, panoramic visions, a sense of contact with something beyond ordinary reality, a feeling of arriving at some fundamental truth. Users of DMT describe it as the most real experience of their lives, more real than waking reality. A conviction afterwards that they have briefly touched something true. Researchers, including Dr. Rick Strassman at the University of New Mexico, have hypothesized that DMT is released in the brain at the moment of death, and that this release may account for many of the features of near-death experiences. The evidence for this is suggestive rather than conclusive. DMT has been found in the cerebrospinal fluid of living humans. Studies in rats have shown elevated DMT levels after cardiac arrest. But whether the human brain produces enough endogenous DMT at death to generate a full psychedelic experience remains unproven. What is striking is the convergence, the gamma surge, the endorphin release, the serotonin flood, the possible DMT release, the ionic depolarization cascade. All of these happening simultaneously, in a brain that is, by one measure, dead. The dying brain is not passive. It is not simply shutting down. It is doing something active, something chemically and electrically extraordinary, in its final minutes. What that something produces, whether it produces anything at all in the experiential sense, we cannot say with certainty, but the chemistry suggests that if there is an experience, it is unlike anything in ordinary life. Let's push further into the territory where most scientists are reluctant to go. What happens to the self? Not the body, not the brain, the self, the subjective first-person experience of being you, the thing that says I, the awareness that is aware of being aware. In normal waking life, the sense of self is generated by the brain. We know this because when specific brain regions are damaged, the sense of self changes. People with damage to the parietal lobe can lose the sense of where their body ends and the world begins. People with damage to the prefrontal cortex can lose the ability to maintain a coherent narrative of who they are. The self is not a fixed thing sitting behind the eyes. It is constructed, moment to moment, by the activity of the brain. So when the brain is dying, when the regions that construct the self are flooding with ions, misfiring, losing their organization, what happens to that construction? One possibility is that it simply collapses. The self, like any other construction, requires ongoing maintenance. Stop the maintenance and it falls apart. The experience, if there is one, would be one of dissolution, of the edges of self becoming unclear, the boundary between inside and outside dissolving. This, interestingly, is exactly what many near-death survivors describe. Not the loss of consciousness, but the loss of the boundary of self. An expansion of whatever awareness remains, beyond the limits of the individual, into something vast and undifferentiated. The neuroscientist Andrew Newberg has spent decades studying the neural correlates of mystical experience, the states of consciousness reported by meditators, mystics, and near-death survivors. He finds that these states are consistently associated with decreased activity in the parietal lobe, specifically the regions responsible for maintaining the sense of self as separate from the world. When the parietal lobe goes quiet, the self becomes boundless. In meditation, this happens through years of practice. In psychedelic experience, it happens through chemistry. In death, it may happen through the ionic cascade. The parietal regions, like all cortical regions, losing their maintenance and dissolving their boundaries. The result, if it is experienced, would be the sensation of infinite expansion, of union with something larger, of the boundary between self and everything else dissolving entirely, which is, word for word, what the dying report. Let's step back, take a breath, and think about what all of this means. We have discovered, or are in the process of discovering, that death is not what we thought it was. It is not the flipping of a switch. It is not the sudden cessation of all experience. It is a process, complex and extraordinary, in which the brain undergoes one of the most intense episodes of activity in its entire existence. Whether that activity constitutes experience, whether there is something it is like to die, we cannot say for certain, but the evidence is mounting that the answer might be yes. And if that is true, if the dying brain is generating some form of experience in its final minutes, then several things follow. First, death may be far less terrible than we fear. The terror of death, for most people, is tied to the idea of sudden, absolute cessation, blankness, the lights going out. If instead what actually happens is an overwhelming experience of peace, expansion, and a kind of luminous intensity, then the existential terror begins to look different. Second, near-death experiences may not be illusions. They may be genuine events, real experiences, occurring in real brains at the edge of biological existence. The visions, the life review, the sense of presence and peace. These may not be tricks of a misfiring brain, but the actual content of what the dying brain experiences. Third, the nature of consciousness itself may be different from what we assume. If consciousness can exist, or something very like it, in a brain that is clinically dead by most measures, then our models of what consciousness requires are incomplete. The relationship between biology and experience may be stranger, more robust, and more mysterious than our science currently captures. And fourth, the people who have returned from this territory, the near-death survivors, may be telling us something true, not metaphorically, not as wish fulfillment, but as genuine witness testimony from a place very few people have been to and come back from. Science is at its most honest when it admits what it doesn't know. And on this subject, there is a great deal we don't know. We don't know the exact relationship between brain activity and subjective experience. The correlation is clear. More complex brain activity correlates with richer experience. But correlation is not causation, and we don't know the mechanism that makes electrical activity feel like anything. We don't know the precise duration of conscious experience after cardiac arrest. The 7-minute figure is an approximation, varying with temperature, individual physiology, and circumstances. We don't know whether the gamma surge in dying brains produces organized, coherent experience, or whether it is simply noise, random electrical discharge with no subjective content whatsoever. We don't know whether the reports of near-death survivors accurately reflect events that occurred during the cardiac arrest, or whether memories are being confabulated, constructed unconsciously, in the hours after resuscitation. We don't know whether consciousness is entirely dependent on the brain, or whether some form of it might persist beyond the brain's death in ways our current science cannot detect. These are not questions we are likely to answer soon. They may not be questions science can answer at all, at least not with our current tools and frameworks. But they are the most important questions we can ask, because they are questions about what you are, what any of us are, what it means to be a conscious creature in a universe that seems, in most places, to contain no consciousness at all. Richard Feynman, the physicist who could explain the most complex ideas in the language of the street corner, once said something that has always struck me as one of the most important principles in all of intellectual life. He said, "I think I can safely say that nobody understands quantum mechanics." Not as a confession of failure, as a statement of intellectual honesty, as the first step toward genuine understanding. You cannot begin to understand something you think you already know. The same is true of death. We think we know what it is, the cessation of life, the end. We have built entire cultures, entire religions, entire ways of living, around a model of death as absolute terminus. But the science says, we don't actually know what happens, not in the brain, not in the minutes that follow the moment the heart stops, not in the territory between clinical death and whatever comes after. What we know is that the brain is doing something remarkable, that the something is measurable, that it correlates with the experiences reported by those who return, and that those experiences, taken seriously as data, describe something that is not the end, but a kind of extraordinary intensification. Your brain has been with you every moment of your existence. It was there for your first breath, your first thought, your first love, your first fear. It has encoded every experience you have ever had into its 100 trillion connections. It has filtered reality for you, constructed your sense of self for you, created the world you live in for you, And in its final minutes, in the 7 minutes after the heart stops, it does not go quietly. It sends out one last signal, one last great surge of everything it has. Whether that signal carries experience or not, whether there is still a you to receive it, no one can say for certain, but the lights, it turns out, don't simply go out, they flare. Somewhere, right now, a brain is doing what we've described. Maybe in a hospital, maybe in a field, maybe in a house where nobody knows yet. And in those final minutes, the most complex object in the known universe is doing the most extraordinary thing it has ever done. We don't fully understand it yet, but we are, for the first time, beginning to look. And the looking, the willingness to sit with the questions that have no comfortable answers, is where every great thing in science begins. Stay curious, stay honest about what you don't know, and take care of that brain of yours. It's doing more than you think.